Welcome back. I'm Professor Patel, and this is my lecture on Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine. And this is my lecture is entitled "Whose Hand Wound It?" That is obviously a reference to the story of Wristwatch. Very interesting character in this story, who is in a story in the story. In fact, Wristwatch is already dead by the time Love Medicine, the events in the story Love Medicine occurs. Let me just start off talking a little bit about some of the things that I'm going to do and some of the things that you should gain from watching this lecture. First thing you should gain, I hope, is a greater understanding of the story. Okay, so I'm going to go through it. I'm going to try to highlight some things that are important that you should know, that you should focus on. Uh, and I hope that these will help those of you who are writing about this story. I have to say, this is probably my favorite story of the four. I do like all of them very well, but I think this one is probably the most complicated of these stories. And by complicated, I mean it seems like a simple story um, in some respects, but it's got a lot more that is needs to be looked into. It's intricate. It's got stories within the story. As I said, it's got the story about Lulu Lamartine and her paraclete. It's also got the story about Wristwatch and his demise. There's another, I'm going to give you insights into the story. Also, I'm going to talk about theme, characters. I'm going to talk a little bit about setting. I'm going to go into some of the language play, the idea of fiction that is present in this story. So it's going to be a lot, and I hope to keep it organized for you. But you should note these things, however important they are to your story, your essay on the story. Even if you're not writing on this story, this is a good practice for looking into a story and getting its details down. First of all, I'm going to give a synopsis of the story. So, what happens in this story is we have a young Chippewa Indian is our narrator. He's also our main character. His name is Lipshaw Morrissey. He is sort of an unusual individual. He he associates strongly with his Indian culture. He seems to know quite a bit about it, including their myths and legends, which are of particular importance to us since we're into stories. And also, we want to think about him as a developing character. Okay, he's sort of a gentle person. He's he's also sort of a bumbler. He talks in malapropisms often, and I'll talk about that when we get to it. He has grandparents who live in what he calls the senior citizens, which we imagine is some sort of old folks' home on the Chippewa Reservation in North Dakota. Uh, and he is a sort of a dreamer in some ways, I guess we could say. We know that he was rescued by his grandparents, or at least that's the story we have. And a lot of times, all we have are stories. Supposedly, his mother, who does not appear in the story, um, was going to put him in a sack and throw him in a slough, which is sort of like a, a creek or a kind of a swampy creek sort of thing. His grandmother, Cashpaw, is the one that rescues him, and she is married to his grandpa, whose name we never get. Uh, so what happens is Grandpa starts. It sounds like he's starting to get something like Alzheimer's. His faculties are fading, and he knows it. There are signs of this in the text that reveal his character. One of those signs is that when he goes to mass, as there's a wonderful blending of Catholicism and Indian beliefs in this story. So you get your Christianity through the Catholic variety, and you also get the underlying native religion of the Chippewa in here as well. So the marriage between the grandparents is what we would call an interracial marriage. It's the grandmother, Cashpaw, is a white woman, although Lipshaw is suspicious that she has some Indian in her because she knows certain things and certain ways that she acts to him tells him that she's got to have some Chippewa blood. And then we have Grandpa Cashpaw, who is sort of this iconic Indian. In fact, Lipshaw calls him a monument. We know that he's been in film, at least in the world of fiction. In the story, he's been in film. He's on snuff cans, in other words, little cans of chewing tobacco. His face is the Indian logo on it. He's also been a tribal council member and chairperson. So he's well known, and he's not just well known on the reservation or at senior citizens, but he's actually widely known. He's his his image is out. He is sort of like our in some sad ways, he's kind of like the stereotype of the Native American. His face, he's got the hatchet cheekbones, the pointy nose, the solemn brow. But you can't miss that Grandpa Cashpaw has a lot of mischief in him. So what happens is, as he starts to decline, a doctor tells him that he can't eat candy. So this is Grandpa. So he goes to Lulu Lamartine, who's another one of our characters, and she gives him candy and other sweet things. We find out very quickly that the Lamartine, as Lipshaw sometimes calls her, and Grandpa Cashpaw are having an affair, and it does get sexual. There's there's a very graphic, telling, funny scene in the laundry facility at the senior citizens um, home, and where Grandpa Cashpaw and Lulu Lamartine are getting very frisky, I will say. In fact, Lipshaw witnesses the whole thing, and sheets are flying around, and it sounds like they are actually having sex, and the Lamartine's wig flies off, and he says she looks like an alien queen, and it's enough to stop your natural urges. So it's sort of a traumatic experience, but it also reveals what's going on to Lipshaw, and he sets about to try to uh, stop the affair and bring his grandparents back together because his grandmother is very sad, understandably, that her husband is not only losing his mental faculties, but he is also having an affair with this woman, Lulu Lamartine. Okay, let me talk about the characters a little bit. I talked a little bit about Grandpa Cashpaw, a little bit about Grandma Cashpaw, focusing on Lipshaw for a little bit. Lipshaw is what I would call a round character, and I'd like you to really pay close attention to the changes that he goes through in this story. Lipshaw is, as I said, he's young. He's fairly self-deprecating. In fact, the first line of the story is very interesting. We first lines in literature we always look at. We have famous first lines like "Call me Ishmael," right, in Moby Dick, which is echoed in the novel Housekeeping by Marilyn Robinson when her narrator Ruth says, "My name is Ruth." Right. So what does Lipshaw say at the beginning of his at Louise Erdrich's story? He says, "I never really done much with my life. I suppose I never had a television." Very interesting, huh? Detail that he's never done much with his life. But we find out that in many ways Lipshaw has done a lot of things with his life. He he has what is called the touch. Now, let me just say a couple of things about this. This is a natural healing power. And this is a guy who has little to no education. We know he failed out of school at one point. We're not sure what level the schooling was, but it had to be either uh, junior, senior in high school, or maybe even out of a community college or something like that. Um, he's got this touch. He can actually touch people and heal them. He can make people's arthritis feel better. He can make varicose veins feel better. He gives a very graphic description of Grandma Cashpaw's varicose veins. He does seem to be lacking in self confidence. We know that he was abandoned by his mother when he was little. In fact, the story is she was trying to kill him, as I mentioned before. But now he has sort of been a free spirit, and the only people he's beholden to are his grandparents, and particularly his grandmother, because she's the one who saved him. So he says that to pay that debt, he will be at her beck and call for her an entire life. Uh, so so Lipshaw, uh, at one point in the story, loses the touch. Okay, and that's on page 291, right? And it happens at sort of a traumatic experience. So, in other words, in the course of this story, he actually loses his touch. And by the way, his touch does not work on Grandpa Cashpaw. He tries putting his hand on what Lipshaw calls his templates, which is one of his many malapropisms he uses throughout the story. So anyway, he sets out to try to figure out a plan to right this wrong, to get his grandparents back together, and to try to, in some way, save them. That seems to be what Lipshaw's ultimate project is. So he sets about to make love medicine, which the Chippewa are known for. And there's different ways to make love medicine. He considers a few different parts. He talks about trying to catch two frogs while they are in the act, right? He says, I don't know about that. There's some other sort of shady things that he can do. And then he kind of has this idea that if he gets two geese who mate for life and gets their hearts of those two geese and that his grandparents eat them, he can make that into love medicine to to get them back together if he can get them to eat them. Well, he spends all day in the slough where he was supposed to be killed, hunting geese, and you got to see the humor in this story. He'll say things like, "I got two perfectly accurate shots." The only bad thing was that they both missed, right? So he's kind of this quirky narrator, but what we must always keep in mind, and what is revealed about his character throughout this story, is that he is a very heartfelt person. He's earnest. He wants to help people. We know that he drinks too much sometimes, or he seems to be sort of wasting his life. But really, he is sort of an integral part of the Chippewa culture in his community, and especially because he has the touch that he can heal people. Well, he fails at getting the geese, so he goes to the church, to the mission on the reservation, and he tries to see the priest, who turns out to be a real jerk. And he says, "I have duties to attend to. Go to the sisters." So Lipshaw goes to the order of nuns, and it sounds like these women taught him when he was younger. And to see a Sister Martin, who's sort of this small, tired nun with brown circles under his eyes. And she is much nicer to him than the priest at the mission, whose name we don't even get. And Sister Martin and Lipshaw have a little conversation, and he has bought turkey hearts frozen from the grocery store. And he's thinking that if he gets these turkey hearts and has a priest or someone bless them, then he will be able to use them as love medicine, right? I think one of the most telling conversations between Lipshaw and another character, Sister Martin, who is fairly a stock character, she's not going to change. In fact, he comments that she hasn't changed. She is your stock sort of caring nun who looks out for people, and she's sort of surprised and amused by when he tells her that he's got these turkey hearts and he wants to get his grandparents back. She thinks he's talking about his own love relationship. He says they're love medicine, and I want them to work. And she's sort of like, "Oh, Lipshaw, you just have to be yourself, right?" And one of the best lines in the whole story is in the interchange between Lipshaw and Sister Martin. And what she says is, when he looks at her hopeless, she gives him possibly the best advice anybody can give somebody: just be yourself. Right. And I think that this story, in many ways, is about Lipshaw becoming himself or maturing. he changes throughout the story. He has changes of strategy, of ideas. He loses the touch, and the touch comes back. Eventually, what happens is he gets the grandparents together. His grandmother is in on it. He brings in the turkey hearts, and she eats hers raw. And he's sort of like, "Whoa, she must really be in love." And then the other one, she tries to serve to Grandpa Cashpaw, and Grandpa Cashpaw is right away suspicious of this whole thing. Okay, so he hesitates to eat it. Then he kind of rolls it around his plate, puts it in his mouth. This is the turkey heart, right? That's supposed to bond him to Grandma Cashpaw. And eventually he starts accusing her of being up to something. Skinny white woman, right? And she's really angry, right? And he's got the thing in his mouth, and she punches him between the shoulder blades, causing him to swallow the turkey heart and choke to death. Is what happens. There's a big funeral for Grandpa Cashpaw. All the relatives come in. It's a Catholic funeral, but there is also sort of Indian tradition in it. And then everybody goes back home. Lipshaw gets to see some relatives there and deal with them, but they go back home, and right away, here's another twist in this story. The story becomes a ghost story. Okay, it becomes uh, sort of a strange ghost love story, right? And Grandma Cashpaw has actually seen Grandpa Cashpaw back in their apartment at the senior citizens. She's seen him sitting in his chair. And it's really interesting that Lipshaw notes his chair empty, but he can still see the indentations where Grandpa Cashpaw's elbows were, and also where um, there was a little stain from the hair tonic on the doily. If you've ever been in like an old person's setup, especially probably back in these days, and we're in the 1980s, uh, you've probably seen little doilies and things like that. So eventually, the the, the grandmother's upset, Lipshaw's upset, and eventually he confronts the ghost. Remember, he's lost his power of touch, so this is just Lipshaw as a human confronting the ghost. He loses his power of touch when Grandpa dies, and he confronts the ghost and tells him that you have to go with your own people now. You can't stay here anymore. And then he tells Grandma that the ghost came back because it died because Grandpa Cashpaw died so suddenly that it came back to tell her that he loved her. And once Lipshaw spreads this very simple information in a lot of ways, the situation resolves, his touch returns, and at the end, we have him with the dandelion fork that appears throughout this story. And I think it's a very interesting symbol, and also the dandelion itself for Grandpa Cashpaw, for other things. But he takes the dandelion fork and starts digging up the dandelions, and as he's doing it, at the very end, the touch returns to him. It radiates through his body. He feels it in his hands. So Lipshaw has had an awakening. He's in fact, if you look at page 291, he says, "You play them games never knowing what you see. When I fell into the dream alongside both of them, I saw that the dominions I had defended myself from anciently was but delusions of screen, blips of light, and I was scot free now, whistling in space." And all the things in some ways that Lipshaw believes, and there are many types, and this is going to lead me into theme of beliefs that sort of occur in this story. But there's the belief in the Catholic God, which he calls higher power, right? And then there's also the belief in the ancient Indian gods, which make appearances in this story, particularly Missapeshu. He's sort of the horny water monster who one day Lulu Lamartine is out on the lake and in her boat, and this Missapeshu pretty much has his way with her somehow, drags her into the water and has sex with her, and she makes it into shore and will never go back out on that lake. That's Lake Macha Manito. And so he's she's done with it. But it's strange that we have these appearances. We have the touch. We have uh, we have we have belief in these ancient gods. We have belief in the Christian God, the Catholic God in here. But ultimately, it seems like what solves this whole thing for Lipshah is having faith in himself. And when he has faith in himself regained, just like Sister Martin told him, he seems to have solved his own problems. And the touch comes back after he uses this newfound faith in himself to resolve the problems between his grandparents. Uh, and nicely enough, his grandmother's always told him that he's sort of a waste of life and all these sorts of things. But and he's got all these cousins, and he's sort of the loner and the weird one. At the very end, when they know the grandfather's spirit is to rest, she says, "Lipshaw, you always was my favorite." Right? And we get this very tender moment, and that right after that is when the touch comes back into Lipshaw. Uh, I want to just comment a little bit on Native American belief and culture and sort of mindset. And I've talked about the grandfather's ghost in here. I've talked about that horny lake monster, as I call him. That is Missipeshu, right? And what I really want to emphasize here is that we read these things and we think, oh, Native American myths, that's very interesting. I cannot emphasize this enough. And I think that this is common in many indigenous cultures or cultures from their old world or their original place, is that when Lipshaw talks about Missipeshu ravaging Lady Pillager, or Lulu Lamartine, excuse me, he believes it. When Grandma sees Grandpa on the couch or on his recliner, it is real. Okay. I've actually had one of my interests in literature is ghost stories. And one of the things I found is that people, uh, particularly Native Americans, I've interviewed Native Americans, even some of my students who I had a young, very brilliant, mentally sound student whose mother died in a horrible uh, car crash, and she was in the car. And she wrote an essay about seeing her mother, waiting for her on the corner, sitting in her car next to her. This was not some sort of fantasy to her. This was reality. I was curious and I said, "What's your ethnic heritage?" She said, "Native American." I think it's something very difficult for sort of secularized, scientifically minded, democratic Americans to take. But I've also found that people who are from, say, Ireland or Mexico or Korea, and particularly really ingrained in the culture, will also talk about ghosts with no um, sort of self doubt or a sense of irony, as if they are real, and to them they are real, and we have to understand that. It's very difficult for us to get our minds around it. Um, so let's talk about theme. Theme, remember, is the idea or concept a work of literature is about. And there are some very attractive themes. What's the one that comes to everybody's mind when you see the title Love Medicine? Love, right? I think that love is in here, but you might be surprised that I don't find it to be the dominant theme. I think that love is one of those general things that themes that you could apply to almost any story. You might even say relationships or something like that, because this is about a relationship. It's about a man cheating on a woman and some family member trying to get them back together. But in reality, I would say that this story is about faith, and you can find lots about faith in uh, in the text. Particularly, let me see if I can read my notes here. Uh, there's faith in God or gods. There's faith in relationships. There's faith in relatives. There's faith in clergy, like the priest and the nun, right? So there's all sorts of faith in here, but I think that we really get Lipshaw's um, view of faith on page 287. Okay, he says, well, maybe I'm here. Hang on. Essentially, what he said. Oh, here it is. It is 287. He says, I argued to myself about malpractice. This is when he's using turkey hearts instead of real geese hearts from geese that were bonded for life. And he says, um, I argued to myself about malpractice, like as a shaman, he's going to get malpractice suit, right? I thought of faith. I thought to myself that faith could be called belief against the odds and whether or not there's any proof. How does that sound? I thought how we might have to yell to be heard by higher power, but that's not saying it's not there. And that is faith for you. It's belief even when the goods don't deliver. Higher power makes promises we all know they can't back up. But anybody ever go and slap an old malpractice suit on God or the US government? No, they don't. Faith might be stupid, but it gets through. And I think that that really um, sums up Lipshaw, sums up the ideas of the story. Uh, and I think that that faith is the theme, right, of the story. Lipshaw is a round character. He develops throughout this story. I want to talk about just a couple of other things, actually, probably three other things. And those are the stories within the story. In other words, the story of Wristwatch, particularly, and the story of the Lamartine and uh, her paraclete, as Lipshaw calls it. So this is the realm of the idea of fiction, right? We're reading a fictional story. It has historical connotations. It does have some supernatural in it, those sorts of things. But ultimately, we are reading a work of fiction. Well, in this work of fiction, we get two minor works of fiction, or at least stories or legends or local sort of I guess they're not urban myths, but something like that. And one of them is, and they both involve Lipshaw's malapropisms, which I'll also talk about when we're next as we're thinking about language. Okay, and these two stories are really fascinating, and they're very Indian stories, I guess you would say, or they're from. You can see the influence of some sort of power outside. And the first one is a story about Lulu Lamartine. And uh, I guess she had a parakeet, which Lipshaw malapropes to the term paraclete, which is also of interest to us. The paraclete, or the Paraclete, is an ancient word for the Holy Spirit in the Christian religion. So it does seem to have some significance that Lipshaw um, misnames a common parakeet for the Holy Spirit, paraclete. And what happens with this paraclete is it flies up Lulu Lamartine's dress, and she has a fit and jumps around and all these sorts of things, but no one ever sees the parakeet or paraclete come out of it. And that's just kind of one of those strange stories. And one of the things you might want to think about is what does that have to do with faith, with the rest of this story at large? The other one is about a character named Wristwatch, who's sort of a sad character. His father died, and the only thing he left him was a watch, and the watch didn't work. But Wristwatch, and they call him Wristwatch because of the watch. Wristwatch wears it all the time, even though it doesn't work. He even sometimes holds it to his ear to try to listen to the ticking, but it's not working. And people even make fun of him. Hey, wristwatch, what time is it? Real jerky type stuff. But what eventually happens is, once again, the Lamartine is in everywhere. This is the woman that Grandpa's cheating with. Uh, she is serving wristwatch dinner one night at her house, and she asks him if he wants seconds, right? And right when she asks him if he wants seconds, he dies at the table. And the watch starts working again. And as he is buried, the gravediggers note that the watch is working and ticking. And this really disturbs Lipshaw as he's thinking about the story when he's squatting in that slough, freezing, eating bologna sandwiches. He's thinking about the story, and it really creeps him out that that watch started ticking when this guy died, and that it's probably ticking there in the grave. And he says, in 200 years, is somebody going to dig that grave up and see that the watch is ticking? And Lipshaw says, whose hand wound it? Is what he would wonder, which is the title of my lecture. And I think that that is one of the central questions of the text. Whose hand wound it? Who is responsible ultimately for all this stuff? Is it the gods or God? Is it, do we get faith in the gods or God or higher power, as Lipshaw calls it, by ultimately discovering faith in ourselves? These are some stories that you want to, and this goes back to the idea of faith. And often in theology, we talk about the teleological argument or the watchmaker argument, right? If there's a watch in the universe, somebody had to make it. And this is sort of one of those theories. So not only would somebody have to make the watch, they'd have to wind it. And that's Lipshaw's question: whose hand wound it? And I think that he asks that about everything. And ultimately, through his discovery of the touch coming back to him, of his revelation about faith, he overcomes his problems and becomes a new person and a stronger person. Last couple of things. I want to talk about symbolism. Now, remember this definition: a symbol is something that represents something else. Keep it that simple. If you make it complicated, you're just going to screw it up. A symbol is something that represents something else. Because if you think about it, just about anything can be a symbol for something else. Okay. Oftentimes they're symbols for ideas, but they can be symbols for, and symbols are all around us. I want to focus just briefly on the dandelion fork and the dandelion. Now, if we think about this, is one of Grandpa Cashpaw's pastimes. He likes digging up dandelions. And we're not sure why, what that's all about. He has a little dandelion fork, and dandelions are considered weeds, so possibly he's getting them out of his garden. But the dandelion fork appears uh, throughout the story. It's in a few places, and the dandelions. We first get the dandelions and the dandelion fork on page 283, right? It was after we saw him one afternoon in the sunshine courtyard of the senior citizens with Lulu Lamartine. Grandpa used to like to dig there. He had his little dandelion fork out, and he was prying up them dandelions right and left while Lamartine watched him. Okay, and then we get the dandelion again on page 284. This is about paragraph 44. It says, but I think he'd already forgot the incident. This is talking about the sex with Lamartine. He just stood there all quiet and thoughtful. You really wouldn't think he was crazy. He looked like he was just about to say something important, explaining himself. He said something all right, but it didn't have nothing to do with anything that made sense. He wondered where the heck he put his dandelion fork. That's when I decided about the mental adjustment. Right? So he's forgetting his dandelion fork, but the dandelion fork seems to have more significance than just being a dandelion fork. Okay, in fact, it's what he claims he's going to go do when he um, goes to actually see the Lamartine. Another thing is that dandelions, what do we do when we get a dandelion? You know, those puffy little spherical flower type things that we blow and we make a wish, right? So there's something magical about dandelions, and perhaps they represent wishes. They represent some sort of mystic, whimsical power beyond us. And the grandfather is obsessed with digging them up. And at the end, Lipshaw has the dandelion fork, and he is digging up a dandelion when the touch starts to flow back through his body, and he knows that everything is going to be okay. So that's a symbolism, and you can think about, you can develop that a little bit if you want to, if you're writing a paper on this. Another last thing, one of the characteristics of literature is language play. I don't want you to miss Lipshaw's vibrant narrative, his humor, his sort of strange ways of putting things. One of those strange ways are his malapropisms. These are phrases that are used wrongly or mistakenly replace phrases that are intended. If you're familiar with, say, the contemporary comedy show Trailer Park Boys, there's a character named Ricky who who uses malapropisms all the time. Things like, he passed with flying carpets, or it's all water under the fridge, these kinds of things. Well, Lipshaw was around years before Ricky from Trailer Park Boys. And I just want to kind of point out some of his malapropisms. There's seven that I count. And this is also sort of those levels of reality, right? We have stories in here. We're reading a fictional story that has a lot of language play. And then within the story, we have a character who unknowingly does the language play. And it sort of makes him more endearing, right? It sort of makes, that's kind of funny, but it's also kind of cute, right? So when he's trying to heal his grandfather on page 281, he puts his hands on the sides of his head and he says, I put my hand on his templates, right? And we know he means temples. um, Also, when he was talking about the Bible, how God used to appear all the time and listen to humans, and now he doesn't. He says he used to rain down fire on those Philippines, right? He means Philistines. Okay. Uh, he also refers to a house with a picky fence, and we know that's a picket fence, right? And that is on page 283. Uh, and he talks about a time when he was a little kid and he wet himself during Mass, and his grandmother got him out of there discreetly. It's a very embarrassing thing to wet yourself as a little kid and soil your trousers. And he says that she got him out with wet overhauls, in his wet overhauls. We know he means overalls, right? He On page 285, he uses mental condensation for mental concentration. And I've already mentioned the story about the Paraclete, which is a term for the Holy Spirit, a very old term for the Holy Spirit, and a very technical term. And he uses that for parakeet in the story about Lulu and the parakeet. That's on page 286. And one of the last ones I noticed was when his grandparents are fighting and he's watching through a crack in the door about the turkey hearts. They're fighting about the turkey hearts. He says, he waited for the crash of wills to end. And of course, he's talking clash of wills. So you might want to think, like, what's the significance of this malapropism use on Lipshaw's part? And what does it reveal about his character or do with his character? Okay, well, I tried to hit on some of the concepts of the class. I tried to take you through the story. I hope I did it well. Remember, this lecture is called Whose Hand Wound It, right? And I am Professor Pichel. And if there are any questions, please get on those discussion boards, ask them there, and I'll notice them. And I hope you enjoy this story as I did.